So, I am here today with John Reher, who is the Managing Director of the Brain Trust Accelerator Fund.
That's right.
So, thank you for taking the time to meet with us.
My pleasure.
And for those unfamiliar, can you start just by telling us what exactly the Brain Trust Accelerator Fund does?
Certainly. So the Brain Trust Accelerator Fund is a venture capital partnership which has a mission to be able to advance therapies for patients with brain-related diseases. Specifically, we have a double bottom line. Our primary goal is to have a return on investment for our investors. The second is to be able to advance those therapies and to give a portion of our management fee and carried interest or profits from our fund back to charities in exchange for their help in sourcing deal flow and providing advisory services to us.
Okay. How did you become interested in the world of philanthropy to begin with, in a personal way or in a professional way?
So I actually worked at Genentech for about 7 or 8 years, and after that founded a venture capital partnership. The founder of Genentech is a gentleman by the name of Bob Swanson, and Bob was diagnosed with a glioblastoma multiforme or brain cancer during the period when I was in the venture capital world. And I think all of us who were in the early stages of Genentech wanted to do something for Bob, but there wasn't much available at that period of time. Despite being the founder of the biotechnology industry, there wasn't much from a biotech standpoint in the late 1990s that could probably benefit patients with brain cancer. That changed over the ensuing 5 years or so with the advancement, with the understanding and the profiling of the Human Genome Project, being able to look at pathways that seem to be going wrong in patients with cancer, and the similarity between those pathways for brain cancer and those same pathways that go wrong in other cancers, much more common, such as lung cancer, prostate cancer, colorectal cancer, and breast cancer. And once we understood that, it was a unique opportunity to be able to intervene in the cancer process. After Bob was diagnosed and subsequently succumbed to the disease, a few years later, another friend of mine, Dan Case, who is chairman and CEO of Hambrecht & Quist, a specialty investment bank in San Francisco, which later merged with J.P. Morgan and Chase, was diagnosed at an early age with brain cancer as well. And Dan asked if I would be willing to take some time off of venture and help he and his family incubate a not-for-profit foundation to accelerate therapies for brain cancer patients. I said, I'd never really built any foundation that was, I never built a not-for-profit enterprise intentionally before, but I did nonetheless agree to do it, and we tried to apply some venture principles to the philanthropic world to try to look at accountability, to try to look at leverage, and to try to look at a variety of other principles that might be able to advance the prospects for moving philanthropy and moving, quite frankly, therapies into the advanced stages to benefit patients in clinical trials much more rapidly than would otherwise be the case.
Okay, so the nonprofit which you speak of, which Dan Case and his wife and Steve and Jean Case formed, was Accelerate Brain Cancer Cure,
That's
or
correct.
ABC Squared, which is a Case Foundation grantee.
Correct.
And you were the president and executive director from 2001 to 2006?
That's correct.
Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about what you did during your time?
Sure. So, Accelerate Brain Cancer Cure is a unique foundation. It's inherent in its name. Accelerate is one of those, it's a verb, and it's unusual to have a verb be kind of like the name of the particular foundation. But it certainly connotes the spirit and the activity inherent in Accelerate Brain Cancer Cure. Cure is another interesting word. There are very few cures in medicine. We hope to be able to accelerate therapies and hopefully one day a cure for patients with brain cancer, but we acknowledge that a cure is something that would be a ultimate goal, but probably something that's not necessarily going to be deliverable in a short period of time. Our whole process was to be able to accelerate opportunities for translating some of the great promise of medicine, which was manifest by some National Institute of Health awards, great science that was taking place in individual labs, but was not being translated into the clinic to be able to benefit patients as rapidly as we felt it should have been. Ordinarily, those things, that translation can take place in a large pharmaceutical company, it can take place in a venture capital organization. For brain cancer, because of the size of the opportunity, the difficulty of the disease, there were a lot of reasons that wasn't taking place. The spirit of ABC Squared was to be able to provide a mechanism to translate some of those wonderful discoveries that were being made in the lab and get them into patients and meaningful therapies as rapidly as we possibly could. So we tried to do enabling opportunities, enabling therapies, to be able to advance the field as rapidly as we could. Something as simple as creating a preclinical screening program to be able to test molecules in preclinical screening. It's specifically designed for therapies for brain cancer. And if they prove positive in that preclinical screening program, be able to move that into the clinic as rapidly as we possibly could. So we created a clinical advisory network to be able to move therapies into the clinic in these very complicated settings for patients that are on a lot of drugs and have received surgery and radiation. Very complex clinical situation, but nonetheless, the advisors that we were able to garner had actually treated about a third of all the brain cancer patients in the United States. So they provided excellent counsel to the opportunities, to the pharmaceutical companies that would provide those molecules for us to test. So we first went out and attempted to identify the pathways. We realized that cancer, one of the things that happened between Bob Swanson's exposure to the disease and Dan Case's was the sequencing of the human genome and an understanding that cancer is probably more a disease of molecular and genomic pathways that go wrong than it is of something unique to an organ. So we realized that these molecular and genomic pathways that go wrong in brain cancer are very similar to the same ones that go wrong in breast cancer, colorectal, lung cancer, and others, for which pharmaceutical companies spend millions of dollars trying to develop therapies. And we believe that if that were true, then we might be able to approach those pharmaceutical companies about their products which they're developing for the much larger segments of the market, lung, breast, colorectal, and ask if they'd be willing to submit their molecules for testing into the brain cancer models that we were creating. And fortunately, they were willing to do that, and we were able to test over several hundred molecules in this preclinical screening center that we had created at Duke. The next step is if we found something that looked promising in that particular center, then what do we do next? How do we convince that pharmaceutical company to actually do a clinical trial in brain cancer, which is just so complex in terms of the other drugs that are present, the therapies the patients are receiving. And that's where we actually created the clinical advisory committee to be able to suggest to the pharmaceutical companies where they might be able to do the clinical trials and what kind of patients and what kind of settings. And that actually has resulted in increased number of clinical trials. We had to look at our success in ABC Squared. You know, ultimately, if we could attain a cure, but that's obviously not feasible in our time frame. What we were able to do is to measure the increase in clinical trials activity, and that increased from an average of about 10 to 15 clinical trials per year when we first started ABC Squared in 2000 to about 2001, to over 80 clinical trials per year when I left in about 2006. So that five-fold increase in clinical trials we view as hopefully in some ways partially due to the activities that we were able to engage in with the community and be able to advance clinical trials for patients with brain cancer.
Great. That's a lot of wonderful work in a short amount of time, and I know that there's more work being done.